Hey, what's up, Lacyans, and welcome to another EAPP lesson. For this lesson, we'll be talking about interpreting and presenting visuals for your academic reports or um, in your professional reports, eventually when you graduate from your prospective university or from LPU-DAVAO. Anyway, interpreting and presenting visuals may seem to be very easy to grasp, very easy to understand, very easy to do. However, they're actually difficult. They're actually nerve-wracking. For instance, if you are familiar with certain English proficiency examinations, you'll know what I mean. Um, even though a visual may seem easy to describe in writing or in speaking, it is actually deceptively very difficult. Anyway, without further ado, let's start with our lesson. Now, um, graphics and visuals, we have actually 6 types of graphics or what we call visuals. And we use them to describe our report. In the purposes of EAPP, for academic purposes or for professional purposes, visuals are very important when you are stating, let's say, for example, a trend, um, a portion of something, or a percentage of something. It is easy to describe a situation using visuals. However, there is a challenge when we are trying to present or interpret a particular visual. For the purposes of this lesson, we'll be talking about most of the often used um, visuals that most schools or most careers are fond of using. Some of them are very self explanatory. I'll tell you later on. Now, before anything else, let's have um, some general guidelines on preparing and interpreting tables, graphs, and figures. Now, general steps in interpreting visuals, we have read the title and subtitle. Okay, very self-explanatory. You'll be able to know what is the visual about and what is the situation that the visual is trying to project or describe. Second, read the captions, keys, and labels. Okay, this is very useful mainly because you need to know the variables being discussed in the particular visual. Determine the purpose. Is it for trends? Is it um, frequency of something? Is it a percentage of something? Etc. etc. Basically, we need to determine what the visual is actually telling us. Next one, identify the organization of information. Is it from left to right, right to left, top or bottom? Top to bottom, sorry, or bottom to top. You need to identify the organization of the information. Is it from, let's say, in a very chronological order, or is it by age, or is it by demographic? Next one, analyze the relationships of details. Now, usually with visuals, though there are times that we make visuals for only one variable, most of the time, especially in academic and professional purposes, we we try to describe multiple variables in a single or in a particular type of visual. Let's say, for example, we are talking about trends. Um, you might see different lines per variable. Lastly, make a conclusion about the data if necessary. If um, if you think it is not necessary to conclude certain things that might be related or not with the data, then we don't actually need to make a conclusion. Now, since we're done with the general steps in interpreting visuals, we'll be discussing guidelines for adding visuals to your text. Now, even though it is very self explanatory, there are times that some people or some students don't have a clue as to what type of visual they are supposed to use, especially with research studies. Okay, so let's go over them. Firstly, determine the purpose of the visual. What is it for? Is it for a trend? Is it to illustrate frequency or percentage? Determine the purpose. Next one, evaluate the accuracy and validity of the data. Is it chronologically ordered from the past up to now, or is it, let's say, somewhat accurate depending on the particular variable that we are talking about? Next one, visuals. Visuals should be accompanied by clear references within your text. Let's say, for example, you have a flow chart. Of course, you're not just going to present a flow chart. You need to write certain text or certain captions to describe your flow chart. Next one, visuals should be placed on the same page as a text reference. So let's say, for example, uh, you had um, you had prepared a visual for a particular research study or for a particular discovery. You might want to consider putting it on the same page as a reference, mainly because most people or your audience in general would read your text reference and look at the visual from time to time. Now, it will be very beneficial for the reader or for the audience, mainly because it will serve as a basis to both your data, the visual and the text. Next one, make visuals as simple as possible. You don't need to do anything fancy. However, you're free to exercise your creativeness, but make it as simple as possible. Last one, if visuals are colored, go for basic contrasting colors. Okay. So what we mean by this is basically if you have multiple variables, of course you would want to use different colors so that your variables on that particular visual would stand out and it would not blend in with the other variables. If you notice with the intro video, the student submitted a visual report of which he used only one type of color. Of course, in a real life situation, it might not happen. However, it did happen, and it will continue to happen mainly because of misinformation and maybe poor choice of poor decision making on behalf of the student or person who submitted the file. Okay. Now, So we have general steps in interpreting your visuals, and we have a sort of general guideline for adding visuals to your text. Okay. Now, over the internet, probably there are more or less. It depends on how most of the people would describe their experience or describe their opinions on the matter. But these are actually general rules, and you might want to consider following them. First, we'll be discussing charts. Now, a chart is a graphical representation of data using symbols that are usually boxes, lines, and arrows. Okay, its general purpose is to show ranks, levels, procedures, and clarifications. Okay, there are two types of charts. We have what we call the organization chart and a flow chart. Okay. Now, before we discuss through that, may I want to um, tell you how would you read a chart. Okay. Now, when you are reading a chart, you look at the steps. So basically, you look at the boxes or whatever shape the variable is represented by. Then pay attention to the arrows or the lines that indicate the flow or relationship. Also, next one, to ensure you understand the chart, you summarize each step or each component from beginning to end and end to beginning so that you'll be able to understand it fully and concisely. Now, compare your mental chart. If you, for example, you already knew what the chart was representing, compare your mental chart to the description in the text, or check how accurate your your idea is. So basically, you would want to compare your opinion and that particular chart. Not to discredit the chart, but to for you to fully understand the chart. Okay. Now, let's discuss the two types of charts. Let's start with the organizational chart or organization chart. Now, this particular chart presents rankings, classification, and level of ideas. Okay. Now, how do you prepare the organization chart? First, use varied shapes carefully. Okay. You may want to choose a single shape. Let's say, for example, in this particular example, boxes. Now, connect the shapes using a line or an arrow. Last one, you may design the chart creatively, but avoid being too distracting. Avoid using too distracting designs. Okay, a little typo there. So yeah, why do we need to avoid distracting designs? Mainly because it would create confusion for the audience or for the particular reader. Now, with an organization chart, normally we use lines instead of arrows, as arrows would represent a particular process. With organization charts, we need to identify the relationship, and therefore we need to use solid lines. When you're using lines, you can use solid lines to represent direct relationship, or broken lines to illustrate indirect relationship from one variable to the next. So that's how you would prepare a organization chart. Now, how do we prepare a flowchart? Flowchart, we present and limit the number of shapes. Still, you can use varied shapes, but use them carefully, or should you choose to just use one particular shape and thus making it very simple and easy to understand. Second, provide legends when necessary. There are times that a flow chart rather, is somewhat difficult to understand, especially if we don't know the term or the process that it is going, okay, or that it represents in that particular visual. So legends would be very necessary. Let's say, for example, if your chart would represent step 1 to 8, then you need to consider writing those legends: step 1, step 2, step 3. Or you can use color legends. Let's say, for example, from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, you'll be using different types of colors. However, with science subjects, hmm, if you're talking about, let's say, a chemical process, you might want to not use colors, as colors, like I mentioned before, somehow present a very one obvious idea or concept. Now, next one, sequence the data from left to right or top to bottom. Okay. This is mainly because the normal person would always start from the left to the right or from top to bottom. Okay. This is a very Western mindset, mainly because uh, they start from the left. With an Eastern mindset, you can actually start from the right to the left or bottom to top. However, since once you graduate from um, the university and go get a job, I would picture out that you'll be working abroad, probably not necessarily somewhere in Southeast Asia, but probably in a Western country. So it might be wise to follow left to right or top to bottom. Lastly, you may design the chart creatively but avoid being too distracting, using too distracting designs. Okay, you can make it, let's say, artsy in the sense that you can use colors. However, you need to consider what those colors would symbolize or what those colors represent, given your process in your flow chart. All right. So again, for charts, there are two types. We have an organization chart and a flow chart. The next one is tables. Now, most of you are very familiar with the table, especially when you were, I think, doing your action research. I saw a lot of tables when I was checking your output. Now, a table is useful for displaying numbers and in columns. It condenses and classifies information to make comparisons between and among data, and helps the reader actually grasp relationships that might be invisible in prose or in writing. Now, usually a table contains at least two columns with headings on the sides and at the top of the columns to indicate what the table represents. Usually, the headings on the top is called a box head, while the heading on the far left column is what we call a stub. Okay. Now, how do we read a table? Okay. Let's make this very simple. When you're reading a table, you read the title first, the title of the table, and the headings. Check whether the information is updated or obsolete. Okay. Next, check the source of the information. Where is it from? Study the headings and their relationships. So let's say, for example, in this particular example that we have here on our PowerPoint, we have name, ID number, section, GWA, and remarks. Then it would suggest that it is actually a table used by the school records or the admin office of a school. Very suggestive. Next, I think you need to read the details with the headings in mind. So let's say, for example, let's picture out variables in this particular table. You see names of students, their ID numbers, their sections, GWA, and the remarks of the school. So when you're looking at the variable, you need to, from time to time, you need to glance at the box head or the stub so that the table would make sense for you. Last one, compare and contrast the different columns. Are they the same? Are they a continuation of the first column and whatnot? Now, how do we prepare an an sorry, another error. Oh my god.
Oh my god!
How do we prepare a table? Now, when we prepare a table, first we need to consider if it is a formal table or an informal table. Let's start with the formal table. The formal table contains complex data, should contain titles actually, table numbers, um, detailed headings. They are actually separated from the text and are included in the list of illustrations. That's a formal table. An informal table, unfortunately, I wasn't able to write it here. An informal table or a simple table need not have table numbers and titles since they function as an extension of the text. So it is actually within the text. Okay, probably in between when the author was trying to describe something. So an informal table should not be included also in the list of illustrations. However, they require column heading. Okay, so of course they need to require a box head so that it'll be easier to identify what this table is about. Next one, use concise and clear headings. Make it very simple and very obvious. We don't need to, let's say, use flowery words for headings as it will cause confusion in the part of the audience. Next one, assign a title and number to each formal table. Um, I can hear you asking what is a formal table. Now, usually a formal table is that particular table that you separate from your text. Let's say, for example, you have what was it? Who was that? A formal table. Let's say on the first page, you have different kinds of tables with captions. Just a brief, let's say, a brief description of that particular table. Those tables that are separated from the text, from the main text, are actually formal tables as they are joined together. Informal tables are those tables that you find inside the main text, um, just to express further or to explain further that particular concept from the formal table. Okay. Next one, use abbreviation or symbols when necessary. Let's say, for example, you are using, let's say you're trying to make it simple, your table. It is actually safe to use an abbreviation, um, especially if you were able to discuss that particular abbreviation or that particular symbol prior to presenting your table. Next one, write the source of the table when necessary. Let's say, for example, you didn't actually make that table. You extracted the table from a different source. So you just need to cite the source as to where you got that particular table. Next one, use uppercase and lowercase instead of full caps. Full caps is nice. However, um, we normally reserve the full caps for the box heads. For the stubs, we can use uppercase and lowercase um, together so that we'll be able to um, distinguish the heading and the variables. And lastly, you may design the chart creatively but avoid using too distracting designs. Okay, what does that mean? You can have different designs, let's say different colorway. If you want to have alternating colors, that's fine, but make it so as it doesn't confuse the audience or the reader. Okay, so again, that's the table. I do apologize for the inconvenience of the typos. I, I'm not perfect, you are not, so there's no point in stopping. Okay. However, yeah. So I do apologize for the typo, but I'm making it up for the with the audio. Okay. So bear with me on this one. Now graphs. There are actually two types of graphs. We have the bar graphs and the line graph. Now a graph is a graphical representation of a particular data. You can either use a bar or lines for graph. You can actually have circles actually for a pie graph, and pictures for pictographs. Each type of graph has specific function and purpose. Let's start with the bar graph. The bar graph uses vertical and horizontal bars that compare amounts and quantities. Now, how do you look at or how do you interpret a bar graph? First, as all chart, read the title, caption, and source note. Make sure you understand what it is about um, and the purpose of the graph. If there were years mentioned, look at the dates mentioned if there are any. Also, identify what is being compared since it is about comparing multiple variables. Is it an amount or quantity? It depends on the caption. Also, find the data changes over time, or let's say if the data changes over time, let's say there were different, let's say the bar graph was arranged in a very chronological way. Um, Determine the time span and the amount of change. Let's say it was a time span in the span of 5 years or 10 years, how much has changed, and you look at those variables and you try to understand how they were being compared to as the time went on. Okay, so that's how you understand a bar graph. Now, how do you prepare one? First, limit the number of bars. Okay, you can have multiple bars, but if you're trying to compare, um, let's say amount or quantity, then try to limit your bar graph. Okay, how would you limit your bar graph? You can group them in, in groups. Let's say you want to group all ages here or all demographics and so on and so forth. Next one, keep the bar width consistent. If the bar width is not consistent, it would mean that um, with multiple variables, if one is not consistently the same with the other two, it would suggest that that particular bar is very important. However, for preparing a bar graph, it is actually not necessary. It is also ideal to use spaces between bars so that you'll be able to identify precisely if, let's say, for example, your printer happened to print it only black and white, then you'll be able to understand it properly. Next one, arrange the bars based on sequence. Let's say, for example, are you talking about are the bars representing a certain demographic? So let's say, for example, demographic of people. So let's say teens, adults, and old people, something like that. Also, use legends as much as possible so that the audience or the reader will be guided on how to understand your bar graph. And like the usual, you can design your bar graph so long as it does not distract the reader or the audience. Okay, let's go to the line graph. Now, the purpose of a line graph is to show trends or change in data form or in visual form. Usually, the bottom grid scale represents time, and the vertical grid represents the percentage of change. Okay, how much did it change over time? Now, how do we read a line graph? Simple. Like most of the charts, you read the title, caption, and source note. What is it about? Be sure to determine the purpose of that particular graph. Is it about change or trend? Um, Read the axis, the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis so that you'll have a clear idea as to what is being compared to what and up to, let's say, what time was it being compared. Also determine the time intervals. um, Lastly, you should trace the line that connects each point and determine changes over time. Okay, as long as you do all those things, then you'll be able to read the line graph properly. Now, how do we prepare one? Was it for? Now, like I mentioned earlier, it is for trends or change in data or visual form. Now, the first thing you need to do is plot the data very carefully. Um, with the vertical and horizontal axis, you need to be very specific, very concise. And when you're plotting, make sure that it is aligned to those, what do you call that, constants. Next one, second one, use different line colors for multiple line graphs. Okay, if you use only one color, it will confuse your reader or audience. Third, make your chart lines thicker than the axis lines. Why? The chart lines are actually the ones very important. Sure, the axis lines are also important, but they are less important compared to the chart lines. So make them thicker so that they stand out. And lastly, do not put the numbers on the line graphs itself. Why? Okay. It would introduce a lot of information in your chart and thus making it very confusing for the reader, and the reader or the audience would not be able to understand your line graph. Okay, now we have the circle graph or the pie chart. Now, did I mention earlier to?
A few moments later.
Yeah, I think I sort of mentioned only two examples of graphs. Sorry about that. Anyway, going to the pie chart or the pie graph. Now, the pie graph or the pie chart or the circle graph for some people, um, it is used to show the relationship of parts in the whole in percentages or proportions. Now, um, when you are reading a circle graph or a pie chart, again, read the title and the captions carefully. make sure that you are able to understand the captions and the titles. Also, note the number and labels of pie sections of the graph. Next one, use no more than 7 divisions. Okay. Once you surpass 7 divisions, oh, sorry, I missed something. I'm sorry. Okay, I got confused. My bad. Anyway, so when you're reading a circle graph, number one, you need to read the title and the captions very carefully, and then note the number and the labels per pie sections of the graph. Thirdly, if there are any legends, also take note of them as they will aid you in understanding the pie chart or the circle graph. Lastly, you need to identify the shares, the quantity, and the percentage of each section. Um, Identify which particular section has the smallest and the largest percentage. If there are numbers beside the pie section, take note of them as they are very valuable information in describing your circle graph or pie chart. Now, how do we prepare a circle graph? Okay, use no more than 7 divisions. If you surpass or go up, let's say 8 divisions, most of the time your audience will be very confused, mainly because you're overloading them with information. Okay, let's not overload our audience with information. Next one, move clockwise from a 12 o'clock angle. So we move clockwise from left to right. Okay, good. Now this is very crucial, mainly because our brains are programmed to read from left to right. Okay, as we are um, being taught in the Western tradition. Thirdly, use only for percentages and money. Okay, you can use it for let's say proportion, still percentage proportion. Um, you can use it for let's say describing a particular demographic in that particular community, how many are young people, etc., etc. So still proportion or percentage. Next one, make it as simple as possible. You can, let's say, have illustrations um, on the pies, but make it very easy to understand so as to not confuse our audience. Next one, label each component. Each component should be labeled, let's say, by a color or color and a text. Last one, you may design the chart creatively, but try to uh, make it simple as to not distract your audience. Okay, now that was it with our lesson, interpreting and presenting visuals. Um, I sure hope I was able to help you in deciding on what particular visual that you'll be using in your upcoming research paper next school year or next semester. Um, do bear in mind that when you are doing a particular visual, it needs to be very self-explanatory. As over time, you won't always be there to discuss your visual or to defend your visual from other people. Okay? If you have any questions, you can send me a private message over at Messenger, or at MS Teams. Okay, I'm usually available from 8 a.m. to approximately 9:30 or 10. It depends um, on my sleeping behavior at that particular time. Anyway, Lyceans, I hope you enjoyed our lesson and you had some takeaways from that. Anyway, stay safe. I hope you're doing well and see you on the next lesson. Make yourselves proud. Ciao.